The first line over Erie, Pennsylvania always arrived quietly, slipping across the surface of Lake Erie like a held breath breaking, the kind of dawn that made the shoreline homes look softer than they were. Decades later, that same light would still be described by those who remembered the child at the center of the town's deepest wound, a pirate, 5-year-old named Mia Thompson. Small and observant, with a quiet resilience that even adults had noticed in 2025, her story had become part of the local weather, shifting and returning with each season, a reminder of what the community lost on a morning that had once seemed impossibly ordinary, long before the mystery hardened into legend. The Thompson home sat on a modest cul-de-sac not far from the old docks. It was the kind of neighborhood where cracked sidewalks and worn wooden porches didn't signal neglect, but simply the slow passage of years. On brisk mornings, the faint smell of cold water drifted inland, touching everything with that distinct lakeside sharpness. It was on one of those mornings in the late autumn of 2025 that neighbors later said they noticed something different, something unspoken in the air, as if the day itself had pulled taut. Mia single quotes, S-World at age 5 was small but meaningful, measured in the narrow boundaries familiar to children. The backyard swing her father fixed each spring, the pale blue cardigan she wore almost daily, the local grocery where the clerks always smiled at her. She was known for standing very still when something interested her, eyes fixed in a way that made adults pause, as if she were observing something they'd missed. Many said she had an old soul, though the truth was simpler. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing every shift in tone, every flicker of expression, every silence. That morning, the streets were damp from overnight rain. The leaves along the curbs formed darkened clumps, pressed flat and glistening, the kind that stuck to shoes and refused to let go. A few porch lights glowed against the dimness of the hour, creating pockets of warmth in the cool air. It was the kind of setting where nothing should have stood out, where daily life should have unspooled as it always did. But for reasons the town would wrestle with for decades, that day did something else. It split in two, before Mia disappeared. And everything after that in those early hours. The Thompson house looked the same as it always had, a pale siding exterior, 2 front windows with sheer curtains and a single light burning in the kitchen. Cars moved quietly along the street outside, their tires whispering across wet pavement. Somewhere 2 blocks away, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Even the lake seemed hushed, its usual churn softened as though listening for something yet to happen. Later, investigators would note how strange it was that so many people described the morning with the same word, suspended dot, inside that suspension. The story began. Residents would recall seemingly insignificant details, the way the fog clung low along the ground, the faint hum of distant construction near the waterfront, the sharp cry of a bird overhead. Each memory, fragmented and imperfect, would be examined over the years like pieces of a puzzle missing its edges. The truth was buried somewhere in those recollections. But in 2025, no one knew which detail mattered, or how close they stood to understanding. Mia walked through the world with a softness that made people lean in without meaning to. She had a way of watching things that made others slow down. And because of that, decades later, many wondered whether she had noticed something before the rest of the town did some shift in routine. Some unfamiliar presence, some subtle crack in the ordinary day that most adults would have ignored. Whether she sensed it or not, the moment that would define Erie's most haunting cold case was already moving toward her, quiet and steady, like a tide pulling in beneath the surface. But investigators were about to discover something they never expected. Even now, generations removed, the earliest hours of the case carry a cinematic clarity in the memories of those who lived through it. The way the town looked, the way it felt, the way neighbors paused that morning for reasons they could not articulate. In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found, one that would take decades to surface, and even longer to understand. And standing at the center of that truth was a 5-year-old girl with observant eyes and a calm, steady presence, whose disappearance would become more than a missing persons case. It would become a shadow stretching across time, reshaping a community that never fully recovered from the day its innocence fractured. The story starts here, in the soft dawn of 2025. Before everything fell apart. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it there? The morning Mia Thompson disappeared had begun with the pale rhythm of routine, the kind that folds into memory only because something later tears it apart. Before the case became Erie's most enduring wound, the 4 detectives pinned photographs to corkboards and traced timelines across yellowing maps. There was simply a small girl in a quiet neighborhood, moving through the patterns of her life without knowing how tightly the world around her was about to contract. In the Thompson household, mornings usually started slowly. The light entering the kitchen was soft and fractured through sheer curtains, catching on the edges of cereal bowls and children's drawings taped to the fridge. Mia often sat at the table with her feet tucked gently beneath her chair, her eyes drifting toward the backyard as if measuring the contours of the day. She had a way of focusing so deeply that even the simplest motion, stirring milk into her cereal, tracing the rim of the table with her fingertips, seemed deliberate. Her mother used to say she lived in 2 worlds at once, the one around her and the one only she could see. On that particular morning, the air carried the faint chill of late autumn. Outside, thin coils of steam lifted from gutters still wet from overnight rain. The Thompson yard was a mixture of untamed grass and small toys left where Mia had dropped them the evening before. A plastic horse, half buried in damp leaves. A jump rope draped across a stone border. A single mitten lying palm up as if waiting to be claimed. These ordinary sights would later become artifacts. Frozen images investigators returned to long after the grass had grown over and the leaves had been swept away. Neighbors recalled that Mia's world was shaped by small rituals. The swing set in her backyard, slightly crooked from years of settling soil, was one of them. She loved its quiet arcs, the rhythmic motion that allowed her thoughts to unfurl. She often watched birds from that seat, her chin tilted upward, her expression soft and curious. It was said that she could sit there longer than most children her age, unhurried and peaceful, as if listening to the wind for stories. That gentle stillness made her memorable, even in a community where children were everywhere and noise was a constant. Her family lived modestly, but their home reflected warmth more than means. A woven rug by the back door always carried traces of muddy footprints. A jar of mismatched crayons sat perpetually on the coffee table. The living room shelves held more family photos than book snapshots of birthdays, picnics, lakefront sunsets, moments that formed a timeline more meaningful than any investigators could later reconstruct. These images would take on new weight once Mia vanished, becoming both comfort and torment for the people who loved her most. As the morning progressed, the town outside began to stir. Cars rumbled through the streets, their engines echoing off damp pavement. Garage doors groaned open. The smell of coffee drifted from porch to porch. Somewhere in the distance, the faint thunder of trucks along Interstate 90 blended into the fabric of the day. It was all so familiar, so ordinary, that no one could have seen the fracture forming beneath the surface. The quiet suspense now associated with that morning was retroactive, an echo cast backward by the weight of what would come. In the small radius of her young world, Mia remained the anchored point. She moved with the measured calm of a child who trusted that her environment was safe, her footsteps steady and unafraid. Her family described her as unusually perceptive, someone who noticed shifts in mood before anyone else did. She was the child who paused in doorways, the one who tilted her head as if listening closely to the unspoken. That attentiveness, gentle and unassuming, would become a haunting thread in the decades of speculation that followed her disappearance. Some believed she had sensed something, a change, a presence, a deviation in the predictable rhythm of her street. In later interviews, a neighbor swore that she saw Mia standing near the edge of her driveway that morning, her body still and her gaze fixed toward the far end of the cul-de-sac. But the memory was hazy, softened by years and guilt and the erosion of certainty. Whether Mia had noticed something significant or simply been lost in her thoughts would remain one of the many unanswered questions of the case. Investigators would later remark that the day itself felt layered, as if the ordinary veneer of suburbia was too thin to conceal what was unfolding. Details that seemed insignificant at the time, a parked truck no one recognized, a flicker of movement near the vacant lot, the rhythmic tapping of construction far down the road, would be dissected and cataloged long after they had faded from collective memory. The old case files are filled with these fragments, each one a possibility that never quite solidified into truth. Mia's last known hours at home were filled with the soft textures of her routine, the faint rasp of her cardigan sleeve against the kitchen table, the distant rumble of a freight train, the warm hum of the dryer spinning clothes in the next room. These sounds and sensations became, over time, the soundtrack to a mystery that never loosened its grip on Erie. Every detail of her life felt magnified in hindsight, as though the ordinary was trying to speak dot in the quiet corners of this small town. A truth was waiting to be found, but it would not come easily nor quickly. The people of Erie, unaware that the morning was slipping toward irreparable change, moved through their routines with the soft confidence of those who believe tomorrow will look the same. They could not know that Mia's story, still unfolding within the walls of her modest home, was about to break loose, sending ripples through the decades to come. By mid-morning, the soft gray light over Erie had begun to brighten, carrying with it a fragile warmth that made the wet sidewalk shimmer. It was the kind of gentle transition that often went unnoticed, but on the day Mia Thompson vanished, every shift in the weather, every sound, every movement would later be scrutinized with obsessive care. What seemed mundane then would become, in hindsight, part of a labyrinth investigators would spend decades trying to navigate Dot in her final known hours before leaving the safety of her home. Mia drifted through her surroundings with a familiar calm. She was a child deeply attuned to the world, noticing textures and sounds that adults hurried and preoccupied often overlooked. The faint ticking of the kitchen clock, the rustle of leaves pushed across the driveway, the distant low whistle of a freight train curving along its early route by the lake. These were the anchors of her morning, woven effortlessly into the fabric of her routine. A neighbor remembered seeing her through the window, standing at the kitchen counter with her fingers pressed lightly against the cool surface, her expression distant yet peaceful. Whether this memory was accurate or softened by time didn't matter to those who held on to it. What mattered was that it fit the image of the child Erie had come to mourn, a small girl full of quiet observation, her presence gentle enough to fade into the background until it was suddenly, devastatingly absent. Mia had no schedule that day, no school hours to follow, no appointments, no rigid structure. Her parents often allowed her to wander the backyard or sit near the front window with crayons and paper. Her drawings, usually simple and bright, ranged from birds to houses to the lake she loved, though sometimes she drew patterns instead: circles, spirals, lines running parallel like train tracks. Many of those drawings ended up on the refrigerator door, held in place by worn magnets shaped like fruit. After she disappeared, investigators photographed them. Nothing within their crayon strokes offered answers. Yet the images lingered as quietly as the questions they could not resolve. As the morning passed, a steady breeze picked up, carrying the scent of wet leaves and distant machinery. Construction had been ongoing on a warehouse near the waterfront for weeks, and the mechanical thrum of equipment had become a constant backdrop for the neighborhood. Some residents later said they remembered hearing it more sharply than usual that day, a low, rhythmic clatter that seemed to settle into the spaces between conversations and tasks. Sound, like memory, changed shape when refracted through loss. Within the Thompson home, the small markers of daily life continued. A coffee mug half empty on the counter, laundry folded in uneven stacks on the couch, shoes left by the door. These were the last ordinary details of a household that had no idea what was approaching. Mia moved among them with the innocence of a child who believed the world around her was stable and familiar. She paused occasionally. These were the moments that would later haunt her parents, most standing still for a heartbeat too long, as if she sensed something shifting. There was a window along the side of the house, where she liked to sit on a cushioned bench, her knees drawn up, her gaze aimed outward at the small stretch of street that curved away from the cul-de-sac. From there, she could see neighbors leaving for work, joggers passing by, cars pulling in and out of driveways. She watched quietly, not with longing or restlessness, but with the contemplative presence that had always set her apart. A neighbor walking her dog recalled seeing the child there that morning, her small hand resting on the window pane. The observation was fleeting, but it would take on a chilling resonance later. The woman could not remember whether Mia had appeared curious or concerned, only that her eyes seemed focused on something specific. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled down the street. Two crows lifted from a telephone wire. A gust of wind pushed a scattering of leaves into the Thompson yard, brushing against the base of the swing set. Everything moved as it always did. Everything appeared normal. And yet, decades later, the ordinary cadence of that morning would feel like a thin veil stretched over something waiting to surface. The last confirmed moment of Mia inside her home occurred close to midday. Investigators pieced this together from small clues: a jacket left behind, a pair of shoes not worn, a cup on the counter still cool to the touch. The implication was clear. She had stepped outside without the usual preparation. No coat, no bag, no indication she intended to go far. This detail became one of the enduring fractures in the case. What would draw a quiet, observant child into the open air so abruptly, without telling anyone, without hesitation? As the hours passed and the case unfolded, some would come to believe that Mia had been responding to something she recognized, perhaps a voice, a figure, a familiar presence that did not seem threatening. Others believed she was simply following her natural curiosity, drawn to some subtle detail in the street that adults might not have noticed. Theories multiplied, but certainty never solidified. In the story of her disappearance, these final moments of normalcy became the most painful. Suspended forever in a space just before the world shattered. In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found. But the truth was still buried, still shifting beneath the surface of a neighborhood that had no idea how much it was about to lose. And while Mia's final moments at home were tender in their simplicity, they carried a weight that Erie would spend decades trying to understand, a weight born from the knowledge that the child, who once stood so still, so observant, was walking unknowingly toward the threshold of a mystery that would endure long after her footprints faded from the damp earth outside. In the early afternoon, the last traces of morning dampness had dried into a thin residue on the sidewalks, leaving behind a faint mineral scent that clung to the air above Erie's quiet streets. The weather had settled into a stillness so delicate that even distant sounds carried farther than usual. It was in this muted, deceptive calm that the timeline of Mia Thompson's disappearance began to slip from routine into uncertainty, marking the first moments when something in the day diverged from the familiar path it should have followed. For investigators, The earliest hours of the case would later become a labyrinth of approximations and educated guesses. Without witnesses who could speak with confidence, they pieced the story together from fragments, glimpses, sounds, misplaced objects, half-remembered sightings. What they knew with certainty was simple but devastating. At some point after midday, Mia stepped outside her home and never returned. The transition was so seamless, so unremarkable in the moment, that no one realized its significance until much later. The front yard of the Thompson home was small, bordered by patchy grass and a line of low shrubs struggling to survive the early chill of autumn. A narrow walkway led to the porch steps, where a faded welcome mat lay slightly crooked. These details, so benign in photographs taken the next morning, would become part of the geography of the investigation. Officers walked the terrain over and over, mapping the distance from the front door to the sidewalk, studying the angles of neighboring windows, measuring the visibility from each vantage point. In the end, these exercises yielded little. The day itself had left no footprints, no impressions, no obvious trace of the small figure who had crossed that threshold. A few houses down, a resident remembered hearing the creak of a swing set sometime early that afternoon. It was a fleeting sound, 2 slow arcs, then silence. She could not be sure it was the Thompson swing, but the timing stayed with her. Investigators logged the detail, but without corroboration, it remained one more uncertain piece in a puzzle with no edges. Theories about whether Mia had approached the backyard before leaving the property circulated for years, but none could be verified. The swing sat untouched by the time officers arrived, its chain still and its seat damp from the night before. What struck many residents in the hours following the disappearance was how quickly the ordinary became ominous. A parked vehicle that no one remembered seeing before. A stranger walking along the eastern sidewalk who did not fit any familiar profile. A delivery that arrived earlier than expected. None of these details meant anything in isolation, yet each one became freighted with possibility as the case deepened. People who had never paid attention to the comings and goings of their street found themselves replaying the day in agonizing detail, searching for signs they might have overlooked. One neighbor recalled seeing a shape small, quick moving past a window, but she could not say whether it was a child or a stray dog. Another thought she heard a faint cry or laugh carried on the breeze, but the sound had mixed with the noise of construction from the waterfront and was impossible to distinguish. A postal worker remembered passing by the Thompson home, but was unsure whether anything seemed out of place at the time. These fragments, unreliable yet persistent, filled the early case files with the haunting sense that someone, somewhere, must have seen the moment the day shifted dot by late afternoon. When Mia had not returned inside and no one had seen her on the block, her absence began to register. Her mother's call through the house went unanswered. A search of the backyard revealed nothing unusual, just the same soaked leaves, the same forgotten toys, the same soft imprint in the grass where she had been sitting earlier that week. For a child known to drift but never wander, the silence was wrong. Too complete. Too immediate. The first wave of dread took hold quietly, settling like a shadow in the corners of the home. The initial search was small, a sweep of the house, the yard, the immediate street. Neighbors stepped outside, hesitant but concerned. Someone called out her name. Someone else checked behind a row of garbage bins. When nothing appeared, when the spaces that might harbor a hiding child remained empty, the unease deepened. The Thompson family made the call to police at 4:12 p.m., the time later printed on every report that followed. Responding officers approached the situation with the urgency such cases always demanded. They canvassed the area in widening circles, moving systematically from house to house. They asked for sightings, for sounds, for anything out of place. Some doors opened immediately, residents pale and shaken. Others took longer. their occupants unaware that a child had vanished until a uniformed officer stood on their porch. Interviews were conducted quickly, efficiently, but every answer yielded the same conclusion. No one had seen where Mia had gone. As dusk approached, Erie's landscape shifted. The soft glow of evening blurred the edges of houses and cast long shadows across the streets. Porch lights flickered on, their halos cutting through the encroaching dark. For the officers working the scene, visibility became a challenge, and urgency hardened into something colder. Flashlights scanned under decks, behind sheds, through clusters of trees. The air grew sharper, the temperature dropping enough that the search took on an additional layer of fear. A 5-year-old outside alone, without a coat, at the onset of night. This detail, more than any other, pushed the investigation into high alert. The Thompson household became a hub of quiet devastation. Officers moved in and out with measured steps, speaking softly, documenting the scene. A jacket left draped over a dining chair. A pair of shoes by the door. A half-finished drawing on the coffee table. These were the anchors of Mia's presence, suddenly made unbearable by her absence. Investigators studied them not because they held answers, but because they were the last remaining pieces of the life she was living just hours before. But investigators were about to discover something they never expected. As night settled over Erie, the search expanded beyond the neighborhood. K-9 units were brought in, volunteers began organizing, and the quiet tension that would come to define the case began its long, chilling descent. The transition from disappearance to active investigation was complete. The calm of the day had fractured, and the mystery that would endure for decades had begun its relentless grip on the town. Night thickened over Erie with a slow, deliberate weight, settling into the edges of houses and the narrow spaces between streetlights until the entire neighborhood felt suspended in a hush that did not belong to an ordinary evening. What had begun as a missing child search in the late afternoon hardened into a full-scale investigation by nightfall. Its urgency shaped by the cold, by the child's age, and by the silence that had taken root far too quickly. The shift was unmistakable, not a panicked frenzy, but the sharpened, measured intensity that detectives adopted when they sensed something was deeply wrong. The first wave of officers expanded the perimeter, moving beyond the Thompson cul-de-sac into the adjoining streets. They knocked on doors with calm precision, taking notes under porch lights that flickered in the cold. Volunteers, neighbors, teachers, retirees fanned out with flashlights, scanning yards and alleys, calling Mia's name into the dark. Their voices echoed against the quiet houses, fading into the distance where the town's narrow grid gave way to wooded patches and steep embankments near the lake. Every sound, every rustle, every distant bark seemed loaded with possibility. The K-9 units moved methodically, noses low, following whatever trace they could find. The handlers noted how quickly the dogs lost the scent, how abruptly it seemed to vanish at the edge of the sidewalk, as though Mia had stepped out of the world rather than into another part of it. This detail became one of the earliest red flags, an unsettling clue that suggested she had not wandered aimlessly on foot. Something had interrupted her path. Something had intervened. Inside the Thompson home, detectives began the detailed, painstaking examination that would later fill hundreds of pages of reports. They photographed rooms, documented objects, and lifted fingerprints from surfaces that had no bearing on the case but were taken anyway, because in the first hours of an investigation, nothing could be dismissed. The house was quiet except for the soft clicks of camera shutters and the scratch of pens against paper. The refrigerator still hummed. The overhead light in the hallway buzzed faintly. Ordinary sounds persisted around the growing dread. The lead detective, a veteran familiar with the fragile space between missing and endangered, walked the property with deliberate focus. He noted the narrow strip of grass leading from the front steps to the curb. He studied the mailbox, the gravel beside the driveway, the angle of the front windows. He paused at the swing set, still damp, its seat turned slightly sideways by the wind. None of it felt out of place, yet none of it offered clarity. The scene held no signs of struggle, no disturbances, no footprints that could be traced. It was as though the day had erased itself clean. The lack of evidence forced investigators to consider possibilities they would have preferred to avoid. Stranger abduction. Opportunistic encounter. A vehicle used to remove the child from the area before anyone noticed. These were rare, unlikely scenarios, but rarity offered no comfort in the face of the seamless void left behind. The neighborhood was calm, stable, accustomed to familiarity. The absence of witnesses, the vanishing of the scent trail, the abruptness of her disappearance together. They created a profile that pointed towards something deliberate. Meanwhile, volunteers pushed farther into the dark. They walked in tight groups along the waterfront path, scanning the tall grasses at the edges. They checked under park benches and along the breakwall, their lights glinting off the surface of the lake, which moved in slow, heavy waves. The water reflected the faint glow of the city from a distance, but here, closer to the neighborhood, the shoreline was shadowed and cold. If Mia had wandered this way, someone would have seen her. Someone would have found a trace, something dropped, something disturbed. But the path remained untouched as the evening deepened. The command post was established in a community center 2 blocks from the Thompson home. Folding tables were cleared to hold maps, photos, and lists of volunteers. Radios crackled with updates. Officers maintained a rotating grid search, checking storm drains, abandoned sheds, and culverts. The work was systematic, thorough, relentless. But each sweep yielded the same painful result. Nothing. In the quiet intervals between radio calls, detectives reviewed the early witness statements. A parked truck reported earlier in the day. A stranger walking near the eastern end of the street. A faint cry mistaken for play. A blurred shape passing a window. Each detail was examined, cross-checked, and scored for credibility. Many leads evaporated under scrutiny. Others remained possible, but unprovable. But there was one recurring thread. A few residents mentioned unfamiliar movement along the street earlier that afternoon. The kind that doesn't register as threatening until much later. Once the context changes and memory begins reshaping itself under pressure. By midnight, the search radius widens significantly. Patrol cars roamed the quieter outskirts of the community, sweeping headlights across empty fields and the entrances to wooded trails. The night felt colder now, its edges sharper, its hush deeper. The temperature dropped enough that the breath of every volunteer hung visible in the air. What frightened investigators most was the same detail that had alarmed them earlier. Mia had left without a jacket, without shoes suited for long distances, without anything that suggested a plan or destination. Inside the Thompson living room, detectives gathered around the dining table, reviewing the early timeline. They replayed the sequence of the day, searching for the hinge point where routine broke. It was unclear, unsettlingly so. There was no clear moment of transition, just an invisible crossing between safety and disappearance. The house felt hollow, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to emerge from the shadows of the night. Outside, the community's energy shifted from urgency to dread. The flashlights moved slower now. The voices calling her name grew quieter, their tones heavier. The streetlights cast long, unmoving shadows as if the neighborhood itself had frozen, caught between denial and fear. And then, just before dawn, as officers prepared to reassign search teams and volunteers gathered in small clusters for warmth, word spread that investigators had found something near the edge of the wooded corridor south of the neighborhood. It was small, easily overlooked, but unmistakable. In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found. But what they discovered in those early hours would raise more questions than answers. deepening the mystery that had already taken hold. The wooded corridor south of the Thompson neighborhood was neither deep nor vast, just a narrow stretch of trees threading between the residential streets and the edge of an old drainage field. Locals rarely ventured there except to cut across the path during summer months when the undergrowth was low and the air warm. But in late autumn, with leaves damp and heavy underfoot, the place took on a quiet, almost watchful quality. It was here, in the thin sliver of early dawn, that investigators found the first physical clue connected to Mia's disappearance. Thought it was a small object, almost insignificant in size, a plastic hair clip shaped like a pale yellow star. Its edges were muddied from contact with the forest floor, and its hinge had bent slightly, as though pressed under weight. The clip matched one Mia had been known to wear, a detail confirmed by a photograph taken just days earlier. But what disturbed detectives most was its placement. It lay several feet off the main footpath, half hidden by leaves, in a location a 5-year-old was unlikely to reach without assistance or direction. Officers marked the area with tape and began a grid search with renewed scrutiny. Flashlights swept across low branches, tree trunks, and the uneven dips of the ground. Each movement stirred the cold air, sending faint currents of dampness drifting upward. The discovery did not provide answers. It provided direction and simultaneously dread. For every missing child case, the first found object carried the same dual weight: hope for a trail and fear of what that trail might lead toward. The early morning light filtered through the trees and muted beams, revealing patches of disturbed leaves. No clear footprints emerged. The ground was too soft, too recently affected by wind and night moisture to hold identifiable impressions. But investigators noted a few areas where the leaf cover appeared thinner, compressed, or shifted. Whether caused by an animal, a passing jogger, or something directly connected to the case was impossible to determine. Still, the uncertainty only intensified the focus of the search. The wooded corridor had a history of benign neglect. Children occasionally played there in summer, building small forts or collecting stones. Adults used it as a shortcut. Pets wandered through it. But in the context of the investigation, its familiarity turned ominous. Searchers moved slowly and methodically, calling out quietly, pausing to listen for any sound: rustling brush, distant movement, even the faintest indication that the child might be nearby. Yet nothing answered back but the steady whisper of wind through bare branches. By mid-morning, a wider team arrived with specialized equipment, thermal imaging devices, additional canine units, and evidence technicians trained to read the language of disturbed terrain. The dogs caught faint traces, but lost them again just beyond the clearing, circling in confused patterns before returning to their handlers with lowered heads. The implication was unsettling. Either the scent was too faint, or Mia had not remained in that area long. Whatever had occurred in the woods had been brief, a passing moment rather than a location of significance. Detectives began mapping potential approaches to the corridor. Several routes led directly from the Thompson cul-de-sac, but none explained how the child might have traveled without being seen. Visibility was decent along the street. Houses faced the sidewalk. Afternoon traffic, though light, was steady enough that a small figure walking alone should have been noticed. The more investigators analyzed the geography, the more they realized how little room there was for chance. The path from the home to the woods without detection was narrow, almost implausible unless she had not walked there on her own. As the search pressed deeper into the tree line, volunteers combed through patches of bramble and knee-high weeds. They found nothing more: no fabric, no shoe print, no discarded item that might confirm Mia had passed through. The hair clip remained the only trace. Its presence, though unmistakable, generated more unease than clarity. The corridor felt like a place touched briefly, not inhabited. A waypoint, not a destination. Throughout the day, Detectives conducted follow-up interviews around the neighborhood, revisiting earlier accounts with sharper attention. Several residents who originally reported seeing nothing began recalling small inconsistencies in their routines. A man walking his dog mentioned hearing movement behind him the day before, but dismissed it at the time. A teenager recalled a flash of color near the woods, something bright, something small, but could not place when. Another neighbor, raking leaves along the side of her property, remembered noticing a figure standing near a distant tree line earlier in the week. Though she could not say whether it had been a child or an adult, memory, strained under pressure, had begun to distort. But within the distortions were patterns, clusters of ambiguous sightings near the wooded corridor, subtle enough to ignore at the time, significant only in hindsight. Detectives noted each one, adding them to a timeline that was still foggy and fragile. What unsettled investigators most was the growing sense that the case had crossed into territory where logic began to stretch. The disappearing scent trail, the absence of footprints, the faint scattered recollections, the hair clip placed where it should not have been. The emerging outline was not of a wandering child, but of an intervention, quiet, fast, controlled. But investigators were about to discover something they never expected. Later that afternoon, as the sun dipped behind a thick bank of clouds and the temperature fell sharply, a forensic technician studying the area where the clip had been found noticed a small depression in the soil, a shallow, partial imprint that did not match a child's shoe. Its shape was elongated, the sole patterned in a way consistent with certain types of work boots. It was incomplete, lacking clarity, but it was enough to shift the direction of the investigation. It suggested the presence of someone else in the corridor around the time the hair clip was dropped. Someone older, someone larger, someone whose identity remained unknown. And with that discovery, the case slid into colder, darker territory, one that would define the decades-long mystery to come. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? The hair clip and the shallow imprint in the soil had transformed the investigation, turning it from a local search into the type of case that lodges in the minds of a community and refuses to leave. Detectives now faced the unnerving possibility that Mia Thompson had not wandered away on her own, that she had encountered someone who did not belong in her small world. The quiet streets of Erie, once comforting in their familiarity, were suddenly imbued with suspicion, each shadow a potential witness to a truth still hidden. Volunteers continued to comb the wooded corridor with methodical care, scanning leaf-strewn ground for anything overlooked in the initial search. Every displaced stone, every bent twig was catalogued, photographed, and examined. A faint sense of movement seemed to linger in the air, as if the forest itself remembered the presence of a child that had passed through. Yet for all their efforts, no additional physical trace emerged. No footprints, no clothing, no other item to suggest the path she had taken, or who might have met her along the way. The case became an intricate puzzle, its pieces scattered and obscured, with each small clue weighted heavily against the vast unknown. Detectives revisited the neighborhood, conducting interviews that went deeper than the initial sweep. They asked precise questions about the day of the disappearance, probing memory for shifts and irregularities. A neighbor recalled a delivery van that had stopped near the end of the cul-de-sac, its driver absent for a few minutes. Another described a man sitting on a bench near the park, watching the street in silence. Each statement was carefully logged, each detail examined under the harsh light of suspicion, yet none produced immediate clarity. The threads of evidence were thin, often contradictory, and frustratingly incomplete. Meanwhile, forensic specialists returned to the hair clip, analyzing it under magnification for fibers, fingerprints, and traces of soil. They discovered a faint smudge of an unknown substance on its inner hinge, a mark too small for immediate identification. but enough to hint at external contact. It was a trace that would sit dormant in case files for years, awaiting a breakthrough in laboratory technology capable of making sense of it. At the time, it offered no certainty, only the persistent whisper that something or someone had been present in the corridor. Alongside Mia, neighbors' recollections began to converge, painting a portrait of subtle irregularities, vehicles that seemed out of place, figures seen fleetingly at the edge of vision, patterns in daily routines slightly altered by the presence of an observer. Each memory was like a shard, reflecting fragments of a moment that had been swallowed into the fabric of time. Collectively, they hinted at a narrative that could not yet be fully reconstructed, a story held in pieces by the living and by the silent earth. Investigators knew that with each day, the urgency intensified. 5-year-old children are vulnerable in ways that demand immediate attention. Yet the small traces suggested a precision, a control, that made Mia's disappearance more than a simple case of wandering. The idea that she might have been approached deliberately, taken for reasons still unknown, reframed the search. It became a question of motive, opportunity, and the faint, almost imperceptible signs left in her wake by the time evening fell again. Erie had settled into its small rhythms, lights glowing softly behind curtains. The faint hum of distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog carried across the streets. But within the homes, the undercurrent of fear persisted. Families clutched each other a little tighter. Neighbors exchanged hurried, anxious glances. In quiet corners, whispers of what might have happened drifted through the community. The words too soft to form coherent conclusions, but heavy with suspicion. The cold case, as it began to form in the minds of investigators and residents alike, was characterized by the absence of clarity. Its contours were defined less by what was known than by the weight of what was missing, the certainty of a child's presence, the abrupt disappearance, the faint hints that someone else had been involved. Decades later, these early days would be revisited endlessly, each statement re-examined, each footprint and hair clip scrutinized in search of the narrative that remained elusive. Then, in the months that followed, small breakthroughs began to accumulate in the lab. Advances in forensic technology allowed previously indecipherable substances to be analyzed. Minute traces of fibers, soil, and chemical residue provided new avenues for investigation. Decades later, one detail finally broke the silence. Something initially dismissed as inconsequential revealed a pattern connecting Mia's disappearance to a larger framework of overlooked incidents in the region. These traces, buried in files and evidence boxes, waited patiently until someone could finally piece them together. In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found. It was a truth that would not emerge quickly, that would take years of persistence, observation, and refinement. But the early signs, the hair clip, the soil imprint, the fragmented recollections of neighbors, created a foundation. They were small windows into a moment frozen in time, a moment where a child's life intersected with forces beyond her understanding. And in that fragile window, hope and fear existed side by side, balanced on the razor-thin edge of discovery. If you could tell someone what really happened all those years ago, who would you speak to first? Years passed, and Erie carried the memory of Mia Thompson like a shadow across the streets, a quiet weight embedded in the rhythm of the town. The initial searches faded from immediate memory. The volunteers returned to their routines, and the families who lived nearby tried to reconcile daily life with the absence that refused to be explained. Yet in the files, the evidence slept. The hair clip, the faint soil impression, fragments of witness statements, all cataloged but unresolved. Investigators continued to revisit the case at intervals, sometimes driven by new forensic techniques, sometimes by intuition, always by the persistent unease that had first seized the neighborhood decades earlier. thought it was one of those late revisitations. Years into the investigation that brought the first significant breakthrough, forensic analysts applied new methods to the hair clip, to soil, and other minor traces collected from the wooded corridor. Minute fibers and chemical residues, once considered meaningless, suddenly provided patterns that could not be ignored. It became clear that Mia had been near another presence, someone deliberate, someone whose movements intersected with hers in a brief, controlled sequence. The analysis suggested proximity, a spatial relationship that placed the child and an unknown individual together in the corridor at the same moment. Detectives revisited old interviews, this time with technology that could cross-reference statements more efficiently. Patterns emerged. The figure seen on the park bench, the man described near the delivery van, the flash of color glimpsed by a teenager. No single account solved the puzzle, but collectively, they began to form a map of behavior. Someone moving through the neighborhood with knowledge of routines. Someone aware of where Mia might be, and how quickly she could be drawn into unseen spaces. The corridors of Erie, once merely quiet passageways, now appeared like corridors of intent, places where observation had preceded action. By then, the town had aged around the mystery. Streets were repaved, fences replaced, trees grew taller and denser. Yet the case never fully left the consciousness of those who lived there. Parents recounted Mia's story to their children. Neighbors whispered about the day that fractured their sense of safety. And investigators, both retired and active, returned repeatedly to the same threads, hoping for clarity from years-old shadows. The community had learned to live with absence, but absence had a way of pressing against memory, softening certainty while sharpening doubt. It was during one of these intensive reviews that a forensic analyst discovered a critical anomaly, a set of partial impressions in the soil, initially dismissed because they were incomplete. When compared against patterns found in a series of similar cold cases across the region, the prints suggested a deliberate gait, consistent with an individual trained in subtle manipulation. Combined with the fiber analysis from the hair clip and faint traces of chemical residues, investigators began to suspect the presence of someone who had been systematically careful. Not random, not accidental, deliberate. The implications were chilling. Mia had been selected, observed, and removed with precision. The timeline, reconstructed carefully with witness statements and environmental data, indicated she had never traveled far alone. The distance from her home to the wooded corridor could not have been covered unnoticed without intervention. Each new piece of analysis, each reevaluation of old evidence, painted a more complex portrait of her disappearance, a small, quiet child encountering calculated design. Decades later, one detail finally broke the silence, a single piece of forensic evidence, long set aside when re-examined with modern technology, revealed a faint DNA sequence previously undetectable. It matched a profile associated with minor, nonviolent offenses in the area, none of which had previously drawn law enforcement attention. It did not reveal identity immediately, but it offered a thread connecting the moment Mia disappeared to someone whose presence had been overlooked. Someone who had moved invisibly through the everyday life of Erie without detection. The revelation transformed the case. Investigators could now trace potential movements, re-evaluate the early witness accounts, and revisit old assumptions with renewed focus. It was no longer a story of inexplicable absence, but a narrative shaped by unseen choice, calculated movement, and carefully hidden intent. The shadow that had fallen over Erie for decades began to sharpen into form. A figure emerging through the fog of memory and forensic detail. In parallel, the emotional weight of the discovery rippled through the town. For the Thompson family, it was both a relief and a torment. Relief that some fragments of truth could now be understood. Torment because understanding did not equate to reunion. The community grappled with the knowledge that a calculated presence had intersected with the life of a child they had all known, shifting the nature of grief from sudden disappearance to deliberate loss. In the quiet corners of this small town, a truth was waiting to be found. And in those corners, illuminated by new technology, patience, and persistent attention, the outlines of a long-hidden narrative began to emerge, one that would lead to answers, accountability, and the first sense of justice in a mystery that had endured far too long. The breakthrough in the forensic analysis sent ripples through the investigative team and the small community alike. For decades, Erie had carried the absence of Mia Thompson as a quiet ache, a wound that lingered in the streets, the schools, and the homes where children played. Now, for the first time, the case seemed tangible, its contours sharpened by DNA matches, spatial analysis, and the careful piecing together of decades-old evidence. What had been a clouded, almost mythic absence was becoming something concrete, something that could be pursued. Investigators revisited every corner of the Thompson neighborhood, tracing pathways that Mia could not have traveled alone. They mapped the wooded corridor, examined old maps of the cul-de-sac, and retraced every possible approach. Each route suggested the same grim conclusion. Someone had orchestrated her movement. The small, quiet child who had once observed the world with calm, deliberate attention had encountered a presence that had acted with purpose, patience, and a careful understanding of the environment. The choreography of the disappearance was subtle, but the evidence, once overlooked, revealed its structure. Witness interviews were renewed. People who had long suppressed memories or dismissed fleeting observations were prompted to recall details with fresh specificity. A man who had walked his dog near the park finally remembered noticing a figure watching from the edge of the woods, the description aligning with movement patterns now supported by forensic data. A teenager confirmed the flash of color glimpsed years before, and a delivery driver recounted a subtle irregularity in traffic patterns along the cul-de-sac that coincided with the approximate moment Mia vanished. Each recollection was cross-referenced, each piece of data layered into a timeline that now held a discernible shape. The psychological weight of these discoveries was profound. For the Thompson family, revisiting the events meant confronting the reality that Mia's disappearance had not been random. It had been intentional. And yet, within that realization was the first hint of closure, the knowledge that the case was not unsolvable, that the truth could be approached and partially reconstructed. In the quiet spaces of their home, where toys and drawings had once marked ordinary childhood routines, the fragments of the day now took on new significance. Investigators documented them meticulously, photographs and diagrams tracing the pathways that had been traveled, both seen and unseen. Across Erie, the community felt the subtle shift. Streets once approached with cautious memory were now understood as part of a wider narrative, one in which the ordinary intersected with the extraordinary, the known with the hidden. The police department issued reports detailing the methods used to reconstruct the timeline, the integration of forensic science with eyewitness accounts, and the renewed commitment to pursuing leads that had lain dormant for decades. Confidence grew that this long-standing absence could be transformed into an accountable, retraceable sequence of events. Then came the final connective moment. A sequence of newly tested materials revealed a link between the unknown individual and a location at the outskirts of town, a place previously searched but dismissed due to lack of context. Soil samples matched residual matter found near the hair clip. Fibers corresponded to previously unidentified strands, and faint chemical traces confirmed presence in multiple, discrete locations. For the first time, the investigators could trace a path not just abstractly, but in spatial, measurable terms. The disappearance, once a void, now had edges. Emotionally, the revelations were jagged and slow to settle. The Thompson family confronted decades of absence, compounded by the reality of deliberate intervention. The town absorbed the news cautiously, balancing relief that the case had advanced against the gravity of the deliberate act that had taken place in their midst. There was grief, always, but now accompanied by clarity, by the tangible outlines of truth emerging from decades of shadow in the quiet corners of this small town. A truth was waiting to be found. And at last, that truth, once just a hair clip, a soil impression, and fragmented memories, had begun to take form. The final stages of investigation revealed patterns previously invisible, connecting scattered details into a coherent narrative. The child who had disappeared without trace was no longer entirely lost to time. Her life, her observant presence, and her interactions with the world were being acknowledged in their full complexity. The meticulous work of investigators slowly restoring the contours of a story that had been suspended for far too long. By the time the final pieces of evidence fell into place, the town of Erie had been shaped indelibly by the shadow of Mia Thompson's disappearance. Decades of uncertainty, of whispered conjecture, and endless what-ifs gave way at last to a framework of understanding, though not a complete restoration of what had been lost. Investigators, armed with modern forensic tools, renewed witness accounts, and painstaking reconstruction, were able to trace the arc of that autumn day in 2025 with remarkable clarity. The threads, once scattered, now formed a pattern. The sequence of her departure from home, the brief interaction with an unknown individual, and the controlled, deliberate extraction from the familiar world she knew so intimately. The revelation did not erase the grief or the ache of absence. It could not conjure the laughter of a small girl, the soft weight of her hand in her parents', or the quiet attentiveness that had defined her presence. But it did allow for comprehension, and in comprehension, a measure of closure. For the Thompson family, the knowledge that Mia's disappearance had been deliberate and that her brief path through the world had been carefully mapped by someone else brought a difficult, complex relief. It was validation of instincts long held, of every anxious thought and every lingering question. The trauma of uncertainty was replaced, at least partially, with the firm recognition of fact. The child had not wandered unknowingly. She had been taken. The town itself, so long marked by the silent weight of absence, began to process the collective memory. Streets, homes, and the wooded corridors south of the neighborhood carried a new resonance, a careful respect for the events that had unfolded within them. Community members revisited their own experiences from that day, reconciling the fragments they had carried for years with the fuller picture now emerging. There was sorrow, yes, but also a sense of shared understanding, a small, quiet acknowledgement that the town had survived while carrying the memory of loss. Investigators reflected on the longevity of the case with a mixture of pride and humility. The meticulous work over decades, documenting small clues, revisiting old statements, applying new scientific techniques, had finally illuminated the contours of a story that had once seemed impervious to resolution. The hair clip, the soil impressions, the faint fibers, and the overlooked details now formed a coherent narrative, each element understood in its role in the broader pattern of events. The mystery, though it had cast long shadows, had been gradually transformed into knowledge. The quietest victories were often the hardest won. The ability to reconstruct events, to identify patterns, to understand without erasing the memory of the child, represented the culmination of decades of patient, exacting work. And in these moments, the true human cost of the investigation, awareness of the fragility of childhood, the vulnerability of innocence, the impact of an absence long endured, remained at the forefront. Mia Thompson's life, brief though it had been, was remembered not only for its abrupt interruption, but for the full texture of her presence, her observant eyes, her gentle attentiveness, her capacity to notice what others overlooked, in the reflective quiet of the final investigation. It became clear that closure was not synonymous with relief, nor justice a simple conclusion. Closure was the acknowledgement of truth, the acceptance of what had occurred, and the capacity to honor the life and presence of the child lost to deliberate circumstance. The procedural victories, the forensic breakthroughs, the reconstructed timelines, all were means toward a single end: understanding, remembrance, and the reclaiming of agency over a story that had been denied resolution for far too long. The wooded corridor, once a site of uncertainty, was revisited with measured reverence. The paths traced by investigators, now corroborated with evidence, were marked subtly, ensuring that the memory of the event remained present but not overbearing. The streets of Erie, the cul-de-sac where Mia had played, and the home she had known were imbued with a layered understanding: the ordinary world and the extraordinary disruption that had occurred within it. The duality of memory, tenderness, and fear. Innocence and loss remained, but it was contextualized, articulated, and given shape. The final reflection of the case for both the community and the family rested not in the answers themselves, but in the clarity they allowed. The small details, the hair clip, the soil impressions, the fleeting observations of neighbors were no longer fragments of a puzzle left unresolved. They were evidence of a deliberate path through the world, a path that had intersected tragically with a child's brief life. And in understanding that, the town of Erie, the investigators, and the family could finally navigate the delicate balance between grief and recognition, loss and remembrance. In the end, Mia Thompson's story was preserved with dignity. Her presence, once so quietly observed, remained vivid in the minds of those who knew her. The absence that had haunted Erie for decades was no longer shapeless. It had form, pattern, and truth. And in that truth, the town, the family, and the investigators found a measure of solace, slow, tempered, and profound, a recognition that even in the deepest shadows, the persistence of careful attention, patience, and truth can illuminate what once seemed irretrievably lost.